welcome back to Easily Explained, where today we will be talking about characteristics of populations. So let's get started. But first, let's review the definition of a population. A population is a group of individuals that are from the same species and they live in the same area. So just as a recap of the levels of organizations, when we talk about ecology, we have our individual, one specific member of a species. Then we have our population, that is the same species that live in the same area. Then we have the community, which is an assemblage of different populations that live together in one certain area. So we could think of like all the living things in a specific area. Then we have our ecosystem, which is the non-living portions as well as the living portions of the ecosystem. Then we have our biome, which is a group of ecosystems with the same climate and similar communities. And then we have our entire biosphere, which is the highest level of organization and basically wherever there's life. So we think of the Earth as a biosphere. The entire complete Earth is a biosphere. Alright, so now that we have a quick recap, a good understanding of the definition of a population and the levels of organization, now we're going to be talking about characteristics of populations. Today we will be discussing 3 important characteristics, although there is one more that we aren't going to go into detail to currently though. Our 3 characteristics of populations that we are going to be discussing today. Number 1, population density. Number 2, geographic distributions. And number 3, the population growth rate. The 4th characteristic that we are going to skip over for now is the population's age structure. But basically, when we think of the characteristics of the population, we use these terms to describe the population. And as we get on, you'll see how, for example, population density can describe a population. It's telling you information about that population. And growth rate and geographic distributions all fall into that same category. Alright, so now that we have a very brief understanding of characteristics of populations, we can go further and dive into what each of the 3 characteristics that we're going to be talking about today actually mean and how they describe the population. Let's start by going over population density. Just as a little definition, population density is the number of individuals per unit area. So it's the number of individuals that live in one unit area. So obviously, depending on the area, the population density is going to vary a lot. For instance, if we think of it in human terms, a very populated city like New York or like Tokyo, these places have much higher population densities than spread out places with a lot of farmland and country and a lot of land and less people. The rural areas, they have a lot more population density than the rural areas. They have more number of individuals per unit area. Alright, so now that we have a brief understanding of what population density is, we also want to figure out how to calculate it. The calculation is actually fairly simple. It's basically in the definition itself. It's the number of individuals per the unit area. So the area is in units and specifically squared, since area is in units squared. So it's number of individuals divided by the area, that's your population density, because it is the measurement of how many individuals are living in a specific defined space. And actually, population density is one of the main characteristics that scientists use to describe a population. Although, obviously, we will talk about the other ones as well. But before we move on to the other two characteristics, let's do a practice problem where you have to solve the population density when given a certain amount of information. Alright, your situation is that there are 36 elephants living in a 6 square kilometer space. So that's giving you the area of the space, and you're given the number of individuals, and you're going to calculate the population density based on this formula right here. Plug everything out and calculate the population density for this specific population. Alright, let's calculate. We know that population density is the number of individuals over the area, which is units squared. We have number of individuals is 36. And our area in units squared is 6 kilometers squared. Remember that area can be in any unit, so it doesn't have to be a specific unit. That's why we call it unit squared, since it can be not limited to a specific unit. For example, it doesn't have to be limited to kilometers. It could be miles, etc. Alright, so basically in simple terms, 36 divided by 6, which is 0. So that means, if we think of it in terms of the population, that if we were looking at 1 square kilometer of space, we would have 6. So 6 elephants per kilometer. And you can see that is basically what this definition up here is saying. It's the number of individuals per unit area, in this case, is kilometers. The next characteristic we're going to be talking about is geographic distribution. And this one is actually very simple. It's basically, the definition is basically its name. Geographic distribution, think of geography, how the species is distributed in that geography. So it basically tells us the area that's inhabited by a specific population. So you can think of it as a range of the area that a specific species populates. So if you look at a map and a specific area is pointed out, like a very small town in somewhere in the United States, for example, and that's marked off as the geographic distribution or the population, the range of a specific species, that would be its geographic distribution. It's basically where it lives. It's very simple in that. It's pretty self-explanatory. So we won't go into too much more detail. Now let's talk about population growth. Population growth is the increase or decrease of number of individuals in a population size, and keep in mind this usually happens over a long period of time. Also, I want you to notice the careful wording of increase or decrease. A lot of the times when we think of growth, we think it has to be an increase in the population, but it's just some sort of change in the population, and so therefore it can also be decreasing. And obviously there are many different factors that can affect population growth, and we'll do a brief overview of them right now, but since there's much more depth to it, we're going to cover that in later videos. So we'll only brush over the surface as a little bit of a introduction to the many different factors. So let's talk about the most obvious one, is that more individuals are being born or more individuals are dying. So those two things can change the population growth. Obviously, if we have a higher birth rate, there's more organisms that are being born rather than those who are dying, we're going to get an increase in the population. And if we switched, it would be the opposite. If the death rate was higher, which we'll get into this more, but if there are more organisms who are dying than those who are being born, the population size will decrease. There will be less individuals in that species. The second main thing that you can talk about in population growth is the members that are joining or leaving the population. And then when we talk about them both, since in the real world, in the population, both could be factors, the birth and death rate and the immigration rate, which basically just means the members that are joining the population that are immigrating in or that are leaving, emigrating out. But we'll talk about that more. And then it gets a little bit complicated because it's two different factors and there are many other factors that will affect population growth. But that is the main overview of population growth and the main overview of the characteristics that you can use to describe the population, because when we think of the bigger picture, all of these different characteristics help to describe a population. If we ever want to understand that population, we need to understand these three characteristics of it: the population density, the geographic distribution of the population, and the growth rate of the population, which we will go in more detail in next video. Congratulations, you are now an expert at the characteristics of populations. If this video helped, please like, subscribe, and share with your friends. And we'll see you guys next time. Bye!